The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Emerging Contaminants in Massachusetts Drinking Water. My name is Michelle Dixon, and on behalf of the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, I want to thank you for joining us today for this important discussion. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Laurel Shader. Dr. Shader is a research scientist at Silent Spring Institute, where she leads the Institute's Cape Cod Groundwater and Drinking Water Research Program. Her background is in environmental chemistry, environmental engineering, and public health. Before joining Silent Spring, she was a research associate at the Harvard School of Public Health, where she led a study in rural Oklahoma on mercury exposure among fishermen and their families. Dr. Shader earned her master's degree and PhD in environmental engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's degree in environmental engineering science from MIT. She has taught ecology and environmental engineering courses at both MIT and Northeastern University. Dr. Shader, welcome.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'd like to thank the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition for organizing today's webinar, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. The topic for my webinar today is Contaminants of Emerging Concern in Drinking Water in Massachusetts. Today I'm going to talk about what are contaminants of emerging concern, or emerging contaminants. Where do they come from? Why are they of concern? I'll give some highlights of research that we've done on emerging contaminants in drinking water on Cape Cod. I'll present some information about nationwide testing for emerging contaminants and note some information relevant specifically to Massachusetts. And finally, we'll conclude with some next steps and broader implications. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with Silent Spring Institute, but I wanted to let you know that Silent Spring Institute is a nonprofit research organization. We were founded by visionary activists at the Mass Breast Cancer Coalition in the 1990s who recognized the need for more research on preventable causes of breast cancer. So our mission is to understand links between everyday chemical exposures and women's health with a particular focus on breast cancer. And we feel fortunate to have the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition as our partner organization. We have a really unique and strong partnership between scientists and activists to address breast cancer prevention research. Before I focus in specifically on water quality, I wanted to give you a sense of some of the other research that we have going on at Silent Spring Institute. One of our major research areas is to study chemicals that are linked to breast cancer, either in animal studies in the lab or in human studies. For instance, chemicals that cause mammary gland tumors in lab animals, chemicals that mimic estrogen, or chemicals that alter breast development in ways that can heighten sensitivity to other types of contaminants. Some of our work relies on published studies from the lab or from human studies. We're also developing new screening techniques with new technologies to figure out which are the chemicals that are of highest priority. Another major area of our research is to study chemical exposures from everyday products. So we have a sense of the types of chemicals that we should focus on. We also want to know what we're actually exposed to in our indoor air, in indoor dust, in food, in water, and in consumer products. Our research team just had a study come out yesterday that showed high levels of flame retardants in the dust in college dorms. A third major area of our research is developing best practices for sharing results with people who take part in our study. When we go into homes and measure their dust, or if we take blood samples and we measure these contaminants in their bodies or in their homes, we have an obligation to tell them what we found, and we've developed new and innovative ways to share that information and to help empower people to make changes in their lives to reduce their own exposures. And our methods have been broadly cited as excellent examples of how to do this type of report back and have been used in many other studies as well. And then one of our ongoing areas of research is to study hormone-disrupting chemicals and other emerging contaminants in drinking water. And that's what I'll focus on today. Before I get to emerging contaminants, which are not currently regulated in drinking water, I wanted to step back and just give you a broader sense of regulation of contaminants in drinking water. So under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the EPA is required to regulate contaminants in drinking water. These are contaminants that have an enforceable standard. So there's a level set by the EPA, and public water suppliers are required to test for these contaminants and to take actions if the levels go above those standards. So just to give you a sense of the types of contaminants that are regulated, and there are about 90 of them, some of them are metals and other inorganic pollutants. You may have heard a lot about lead in drinking water in recent months, particularly after the situation in Flint, Michigan, where many people were exposed to high levels of lead in drinking water. Lead is not a contaminant that usually comes from the water itself, but it's more of a contaminant that enters the water by leaching from pipes or from solder and plumbing. Other types of contaminants that are regulated include pesticides, solvents, petroleum products, and other organic pollutants. Some contaminants are of concern because they have radioactivity, and I would note that not all contaminants come from human pollution. So in the case of uranium and arsenic, these are naturally occurring contaminants, and we find them at elevated levels in certain parts of the state and in parts of the country, depending on the local geology. Not all contaminants are chemicals. Some of the contaminants that are regulated in drinking water are pathogens, such as coliform bacteria, Giardia, or Cryptosporidium. So these are microorganisms that can cause a waterborne disease. In order to fight these types of pathogens, public water supplies often disinfect the water with chlorine or other related chemicals. Those disinfectants, though, are also regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act because they can be harmful to health at high levels. And in addition, these chemicals can react with the water itself and with naturally occurring chemicals in the water to form what are called disinfection byproducts. And some of these are considered cancer-causing chemicals. So the Safe Drinking Water Act regulates the process of chlorination to make sure we have enough of the disinfectants to fight pathogens, but minimize other unwanted side effects. So right now, EPA currently regulates about 100 different contaminants in drinking water. We know there's something like 80,000 chemicals in common use. So what are other contaminants of concern? Well, if you look at the news, you'll get some ideas of other types of contaminants that are of concern. Just last week, there was an article online that said there are drugs in your drinking and bottled water. There are studies that show that fish and other aquatic organisms in certain rivers can undergo changes because of hormone disruption. In particular, male fish can be feminized in the presence of hormone-disrupting chemicals. And in 2002, the Associated Press released a study showing that pharmaceuticals were present in the drinking water of over 40 million Americans. That got a lot of attention. It prompted a lot of research and also led to some humorous interpretations of those findings. So I want to talk about this term contaminants of emerging concern, or CECs, or emerging contaminants. There's no set list of what's considered an emerging contaminant, but we can think about what types of characteristics these contaminants share. So when we say contaminants, this usually means a chemical showing up somewhere where we don't expect it to be. So contaminants of emerging concern are showing up in drinking water, surface water, and groundwater. So we expect pharmaceuticals to be in our medicines when we're actually consuming them because we're ill. We don't expect them to be in the water, though, that we're drinking at the same time. Now let's look at the word emerging. In many cases, these contaminants are considered emerging because it's really our awareness of their presence in water that's emerging. In recent years, with improved technologies, scientists can now measure parts per trillion or even lower concentrations. So we're seeing more chemicals than we used to. The analogy I like to use is to think of looking at the night sky, say with just some binoculars, and you'll see some stars, but then if you go to an observatory and look through a very powerful telescope, you'll realize that that same night sky has many more stars than you could see. In some cases, chemicals can be considered emerging because we know that there are new chemicals that go into production every year as well. And now on to concern. I'd say that the best documented concerns related to emerging contaminants have to do with ecological effects. It's easier to study fish, and the impacts of endocrine disruptors, in particular in aquatic organisms, have been well documented. So in many rivers, say in the Potomac River, downstream of wastewater treatment plants, scientists have found that male fish have been feminized. And this means that this has implications for the ability of populations of fish and other aquatic organisms to reproduce and sustain themselves. There was a very famous study in an experimental lake in Canada, kind of the guinea pigs of the lake research world. Scientists added just a few parts per trillion of a hormone found in birth control pills, ethinylestradiol. And what they saw was that the fathead minnow population crashed following the addition of this hormone. And the population didn't come back until scientists stopped adding that hormone. So it goes to show that even low parts per trillion levels can be of concern. In the case of human health effects, there's a lot more uncertainty. Many contaminants of emerging concern have been linked to human health effects at high levels of exposure, but the effect of low dose exposure, which are more typically found in drinking water, over long periods of time in certain mixtures remain unknown. And we'll talk more about this later on in the presentation. So again, there's no set list of what's considered an emerging contaminant, but people often think of wastewater, particularly household wastewater, as one of the important sources. So if you think about what's in your household wastewater, you can think of all the products in your home that in some way could get into your wastewater by being flushed down your toilet or go down your sink, your bathtub, or in your washing machine. I'm an environmental chemist, so I look at all these products and I think of all the chemicals that are in these products. So our bodies excrete hormones, both natural and synthetic hormones, pathogens, and pharmaceuticals. When we take a medication, a fair portion of that drug is not absorbed by our body and can enter wastewater. Personal care products and cleaning products have things like antimicrobials, preservatives, fragrance, and detergent compounds. Our clothing and our pans can have highly fluorinated chemicals and things like Scotchgard and Teflon. Our couches can have flame retardants, and scientists have shown that dust can pick up flame retardants from couches, and that dust can end up being on clothes and end up in wastewater through laundering. And even certain food additives like artificial sweeteners are considered emerging contaminants as well. So once emerging contaminants end up in your wastewater, then what happens to them? So depending on where you live, your wastewater might go to a sewage treatment plant, or if you're one of the 20% of Americans who have a septic system, your wastewater goes into a septic system in your backyard. Septic systems and wastewater treatment plants are not specifically designed to remove emerging contaminants. Some of them will break down anyways, just given the biological and physical properties or separation techniques that happen in wastewater treatment plants and septic systems. A portion will end up in the sludge, and this can be of concern when that sludge is applied to the land. And then a portion will end up in effluent, so the water that passes through a septic system or a wastewater treatment plant and can ultimately be released into a river, a lake, or in the case of septic systems, into groundwater. And if you're downstream of a wastewater treatment plant, or if you're drawing water from a well that's downstream of someone else's septic system, some of that wastewater can end up in your drinking water. So you might wonder, well, I know my water comes from a treatment plant. Can the treatment that they do at the water treatment plant get out these emerging contaminants? The answer is it depends. So the removal in a drinking water treatment plant depends on properties of the chemical, and it depends on the type of treatment. So I pulled just some example data from a report in 2007, and I've shown their findings for 3 different chemicals: ibuprofen, which is the main ingredient in Advil, sulfamethoxazole, which is an antibiotic, and TCEP, which is a chlorinated flame retardant. These are 3 different types of disinfection that are commonly used in drinking water treatment plants, and powdered activated carbon is designed to remove certain types of contaminants as well. Again, drinking water treatment plants are not required to try to remove pharmaceuticals or other emerging contaminants. What we see here is that some of them are anyways. So for instance, sulfamethoxazole is pretty well removed, or at least degraded, by these disinfection techniques, whereas this chlorinated flame retardant is not well removed. We also see different patterns where ibuprofen is well removed with disinfection, but poorly removed with activated carbon. So there's a combination of the chemical properties and the types of treatment. In general, ozonation and advanced oxidation do a better job of removing emerging contaminants than chlorination or UV disinfection. So the sum of that is that some emerging contaminants can be removed with drinking water treatment, but some will still be persistent. So now I'm going to shift our attention to our studies on Cape Cod. When we were founded in the 1990s, we had a lot of questions about why rates of breast cancer are higher on Cape Cod and the islands compared to other parts of the state. And our first executive director, Harley Strauss, hypothesized that that might have to do with the water supply in the Cape and some factors that make Cape Cod water supplies particularly vulnerable. So if you live on the Cape or if you spend any time in the Cape, you may know that there's a lot of active discussion right now about wastewater, about nutrient pollution, and about algae in coastal waters. And Cape communities are developing plans to address this nutrient contamination. We've been thinking a lot about drinking water quality as well, and we were really glad to see this article in the Boston Globe magazine last summer that highlighted some of the challenges that communities on Cape Cod are facing in terms of protecting their drinking water quality. As I mentioned, there are some factors that make Cape Cod water supplies relatively vulnerable. Some of these factors include the fact that 85% of homes on the Cape are served by septic systems. So most wastewater undergoes treatment just in people's backyard and gets dispersed over a broad geographical area on the Cape. The Cape Cod has a sand and gravel aquifer, and so the soils are relatively sandy, so there's less opportunity for contaminant breakdown compared to other types of soils. And there aren't the same sort of barriers that you might have as well in terms of the geology. In recent decades, the population on the Cape has dramatically increased, so that puts more pressure, more pollution on the water resources. And in terms of how people, where people get their drinking water from, all residents rely on groundwater for their drinking water. 80% of residents are served by large public wells, and 20% of residents have a private well. So I could do a whole webinar just on our studies of Cape Cod drinking water, but for the sake of time, I'll just provide a short overview. We conducted 2 studies that looked at 20 public drinking water wells and 20 private wells located all throughout Cape Cod. We selected some wells that were in relatively pristine areas where we did not expect to see emerging contaminants. We selected some wells in highly developed areas where we thought there would be the greatest potential for these contaminants to show up, and then some wells with moderate nearby development. And we tested for around 100 different types of contaminants, including pharmaceuticals, hormones, flame retardants, and fluorinated chemicals. So here are some of the types of contaminants that showed up most frequently in our drinking water studies. We found a range of pharmaceuticals, including antibiotics and medications for epilepsy and anxiety. We found certain flame retardants, for instance, chlorinated flame retardants that are used in furniture foam. We found a range of fluorinated chemicals. I'll talk a little bit more about these in detail. These have been on our mind a lot lately. These are chemicals found in things like Scotchgard, Stainmaster, and Teflon. And we also found an artificial sweetener called acesulfame. This was actually the chemical we found most frequently in our study of private wells. And it actually is a pretty good tracer or marker for wastewater impact. And if we found that artificial sweetener, it was a good indication that there were some of these other types of emerging contaminants there as well. I wanted to point out that in our public well study, that the highest levels that we found for 2 pharmaceuticals exceeded the highest levels that had been found in other public water supplies at that time. In addition to identifying the specific chemicals on our list of analytes, we also wanted to know what were the characteristics of wells that were most likely to have emerging contaminants and have them at the highest levels. One of the factors that we considered was the extent of land development in the well recharge area. So that's the area of land that potentially provides water to that well. So what I'm showing here is that for wells with increasing levels of residential development in their recharge area, going from green to yellow to orange is more development. We see that there are on average, higher concentrations of pharmaceuticals. This is just showing the total pharmaceutical concentration that we measured in each well. So that means that preserving open land around wells protects water quality. That open land can be a barrier or a buffer between pollution sources and water. We also looked for relationships between emerging contaminants and nitrate. So nitrate is regulated in drinking water. There's a drinking water standard for it because at high levels it can be harmful to infants. Therefore, public water supplies routinely test for nitrate, and we have a lot of information about nitrate levels. On Cape Cod, the largest source of nitrate is septic systems. So we expected that wells with higher levels of nitrate would also have higher levels of other contaminants that we expected could get into groundwater from septic systems as well. What I'm showing here are that wells with higher levels of nitrate, going from 0.5 up to over 2.5 parts per million nitrate, tended to have more emerging contaminants. So these were all wells that were under the drinking water standard of 10, but even at these lower levels, it's letting us know that wells with more nitrate are likely to have more pharmaceuticals and other emerging contaminants. And we think that that can be a useful marker in other locations as well. So I wanted to spend a minute or two to talk in particular about another family of emerging contaminants. These are called highly fluorinated chemicals, or PFASs. We used to call them PFCs. This is a family of very persistent synthetic or man-made chemicals. A recent study estimated that there are over 3,000 PFASs on the global market. Because they have these very strong carbon-fluorine bonds, it makes the molecules very resistant to breaking down. They're used in a wide array of consumer products. So anything with Scotchgard, Stainmaster, Gore-Tex, or Teflon, and a grease-proof, waterproof, stain-resistant coatings often contain these highly fluorinated chemicals. We released a study earlier this year that found that many samples of fast food packaging, particularly paper wrappers, tended to have fluorinated chemicals, which are added to make the papers grease resistant. So not surprisingly, because these chemicals are so persistent and because they're used in so many products in our daily lives, over 97% of Americans have detectable levels of PFASs in their blood. And this is of concern because for the PFASs that we have the most information about, particularly 8 carbon chain compounds, PFOS and PFOA, these chemicals have been linked to cancer, thyroid disease, immune suppression, low birth weight, and other health effects. Those 2 compounds in particular are being phased out, but they're being replaced by other highly fluorinated chemicals, and there are concerns that these replacement compounds will have some of the same toxicity. We know they're also persistent, and they have some similar properties in terms of their chemical structure and behavior. Another important source of highly fluorinated chemicals into the environment are certain firefighting foams. These are Class B foams, and they're used to put out fuel fires. So they often end up in groundwater close to fire training areas and airports where those types of firefighting foams are used. So when we conducted our study of public wells in 2010 on Cape Cod, we found that a number of the wells we tested contained PFOS in particular. In some cases, we think that septic systems could be the source. Again, we know that these chemicals can end up in wastewater, so it wasn't surprising to see that they could show up in wells that are impacted by septic systems. Landfills also can be a source of highly fluorinated chemicals. But the highest levels that we found were in the Hyannis water system in wells that were close to the county fire training area into the municipal airport. And there's been extensive studies, or testing, I should say, since then of the wells in Hyannis and have found that some of the levels in the wells exceeded health guidelines. Last year, the EPA lowered its health guideline for PFOS and PFOA in drinking water. So overnight, water supplies across the country, including Hyannis, now exceeded the new health guideline. Hyannis issued a do not drink advisory for pregnant women, nursing mothers, and for children, which was in effect until they could bring the levels of these highly fluorinated chemicals down through a mixture of treatment and purchasing water that did not have these high levels of fluorinated chemicals. So thinking more broadly, not just about the fluorinated chemicals, but the flame retardants and the pharmaceuticals that we detected in drinking water, these chemicals were found at what we would consider fairly low concentrations, parts per trillion. So a reasonable question is, how concerned should we be? These seem like very low concentrations. And it is important to think about the magnitude of exposures. So if you're taking a medication to treat a certain health condition, that therapeutic dose, that amount of chemical that you're ingesting is orders of magnitude, probably millions of times higher than you would ever get from drinking water that had pharmaceuticals. It's also important to recognize that if you have a stain-resistant carpet in your house, or if you have foam furniture, that exposures to flame retardants or fluorinated chemicals might be much higher through direct exposure to those products than you would get through drinking water. And I'd also mention that for the drinking water standards we have in place now, those are typically at the parts per billion range, or micrograms per liter. So those are kind of higher range of concentrations that we're used to thinking about in terms of regulation. We're not used to regulating compounds at parts per trillion. And it's important to note that just because we find a chemical in water, that doesn't automatically mean that it's of health concern. Nevertheless, I think that the presence of emerging contaminants in drinking water does raise concerns. So in the case of pharmaceuticals, it's true that the amount of antibiotics that you would get in the water or pain medications will not actually reach a therapeutic dose. But we also know that drugs are designed to be potent. They're intended for certain people at certain times. And we don't give them to pregnant women or to children because we know the developing body can be particularly sensitive. We know that medications can have side effects at levels below the therapeutic dose. We also recognize that some people are more sensitive than others. Think of antibiotics in people who are sensitive or allergic to certain antibiotics. Scientists are also learning more about potential synergistic or interactive effects of chemical mixtures, and they recognize the potential for there to be effects when chemicals are present in certain combinations that we might not pick up on when we study each one separately. Scientists are learning more about the importance of studying certain windows of exposure, for instance, in the womb and during early life when the growing body is particularly sensitive. And I'd like to emphasize that our understanding of health effects is evolving, and that sometimes levels that we think are safe at one point in time later turn out to be levels of concern. Just to illustrate that, I'm showing here on this slide the evolution of state and federal guidelines for those two fluorinated chemicals, PFOS and PFOA. And this graph is intended to be a little bit messy and confusing intentionally. What it's showing is that over time, different state and federal agencies have come up with different guidelines. And there's kind of a downward trend here as we learn more and more about potential health effects. And I'll highlight here the new guideline that EPA released last year for the sum of these two chemicals of 70 parts per trillion. I'll also note that certain state agencies, for instance in Vermont and New Jersey, have developed their own guidelines, which are in fact lower than the EPA guidelines. Research by Philippe Grandjean at the Harvard School of Public Health has suggested that even lower levels may be of concern, particularly regarding children and their immune system response. So I've summarized some of our key findings on Cape Cod. Now I want to step back a little bit and think about what types of information we have about emerging contaminants in drinking water in Massachusetts and throughout the country more broadly. So how common are emerging contaminants in drinking water? Is it surprising that we found pharmaceuticals and other contaminants in drinking water on Cape Cod? And it turns out that pharmaceuticals and other emerging contaminants are often found in drinking water sources, especially those that are impacted by wastewater. So in many communities, a drinking water treatment plant will pull water from a river. Now, if that city is downstream of another city, chances are that drinking water treatment plant is pulling in water that used to be wastewater in another city. And so it's very common for pharmaceuticals to show up in drinking water. We have also seen, though, that better source water protection minimizes emerging contaminants in drinking water. So if you have more of a buffer around your water supply, you're less likely to see emerging contaminants. I think a really good example of that is for those of us in the Boston area who rely on MWRA water. Our water comes from the Quabbin Reservoir in western Massachusetts, and there's extensive source water protection. There's a lot of open land around that reservoir. And in 2008, when the MWRA tested for pharmaceuticals in their water, not surprisingly, they did not find any. So for those of us that rely on MWRA, we're fortunate to have a relatively pristine source of drinking water. When we did our studies on Cape Cod and we said, okay, we have these levels in our drinking water on the Cape, how does that compare to levels in other parts of the country? We found that there's really no coordinated effort, for the most part, to measure things like pharmaceuticals in drinking water. There are some studies that have been conducted by researchers. Some have been conducted by federal agencies, such as the U.S. Geological Survey. But because they're not regulated, there's really no coordinated and ongoing monitoring effort. I would note that there is some nationwide monitoring coordinated by EPA under a program called the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, or UCMR. And the goal for this program is it's kind of a scoping mission. It gives the EPA information about how common certain contaminants are in drinking water throughout the country, and it helps them prioritize which ones are candidates for regulation down the road. So this UCMR program involves all public water supplies that serve over 10,000 people and a relatively small sampling of water supplies that serve under 10,000 people. In the most recent round of monitoring, so UCMR 3, which took place from 2013 to 2015, public water supplies tested for 30 different contaminants. I'm not going to talk about all of them today. I just wanted to provide a few examples. So I'll talk about the results for highly fluorinated chemicals. So the, public water supplies tested for PFOS, PFOA, and 4 other highly fluorinated chemicals. And I'll also mention the example of 1,4-dioxane, which showed up in a number of water samples that were tested as well. Pharmaceuticals and consumer products were not included in this nationwide monitoring. I was part of a study that was published last year that used that UCMR data and determined that the drinking water of 6 million Americans had contained levels of these highly fluorinated chemicals above that guideline that EPA developed last May. The good news is that in response to that testing and to water supplies realizing they were over the guideline, a number of them have taken steps to either shut off the most contaminated water supplies or to install treatment to remove those highly fluorinated chemicals. And this just shows you the long list of contributors to this research. And the goal for the paper was really to look at what types of sources seem to be important contributors to these highly fluorinated chemicals showing up in public drinking water supplies. The paper involved a geographical analysis looking for certain types of sources in the large watershed area around each public water supply. Not surprisingly, we saw that water supplies that were close to an industrial site where these chemicals were produced, so near a 3M or DuPont facility, or near a military fire training academy where those firefighting foams are frequently used. Those water supplies were much more likely to have detectable levels of PFASs. We also found that public water supplies within the same subbasin, again, large watershed area, as an airport certified to use those types of firefighting foams that contain fluorinated chemicals, as well as a number of wastewater treatment plants, were also more likely to have detectable levels of highly fluorinated chemicals. We also observed that a number of public water supplies that contain these highly fluorinated chemicals were not close to any of these types of sources. And it tells us that there are other types of important sources to drinking water contamination that are out there. Looking a little bit closer to home, following the new EPA guideline last year, the water system in Westfield, in western Massachusetts, turned off 2 of their wells because of exceedances of that new guideline, likely coming from firefighting foams. And just last last month, a well in Mashpee, which is close to Joint Base Cape Cod, also turned off one of its wells because the levels of the PFASs were above the federal guideline. So to summarize the results for Massachusetts for PFASs, there were 170 public water supplies in Massachusetts that tested for highly fluorinated chemicals. I would point out that the test that was used to measure these highly fluorinated chemicals was not particularly sensitive. So there were many water systems that did not have detectable levels according to this, this study, but I would guess that some of those do have fluorinated chemicals at levels that weren't detectable. However, there were 5 public water supplies in Massachusetts that had highly fluorinated chemicals detected. This is again through the UCMR testing by EPA. So we've already talked about Hyannis and Mashpee and Westfield. This is just showing the levels of PFOS and a related compound, PFHXS. These are often the ones that are highest in firefighting foams. This is PFOA, also called C8. And this has also been in the news, for instance, because of drinking water contamination in Hoosick Falls in New York and North Bennington in Vermont. We also see that, that some of the water samples collected from Danvers and Hudson's public water supplies had detectable levels of these 2 fluorinated chemicals. Probably not from firefighting foam, since there was no presence of detectable PFAS, but other probably industrial sources. I did want to note that the concentrations in these individual water samples are not necessarily indicative of concentrations in tap water, because these water supplies pull water from multiple different sources. I wanted to talk about another emerging contaminant called 1,4-dioxane. I put a little asterisk to remind myself to say that this is not the same as dioxin, even though they sound almost the same. This is a chemical that's used as a solvent in paint thinners and varnishes, and it also forms unintentionally during the production of certain types of shampoos and detergents. 1,4-dioxane has been classified as a chemical likely to cause cancer based on animal studies by the EPA. Massachusetts has issued a drinking water guideline of 300 parts per trillion, or 0.3 parts per billion, which is similar to the federal guideline of 0.35 parts per billion, or 350 parts per trillion. In the case of highly fluorinated chemicals, when a water supply finds high levels of PFOS and PFOA, they're able to install a treatment technique called activated carbon, which is effective at removing at least the long chain fluorinated chemicals that are of greatest concern right now. By contrast, 1,4-dioxane is actually really hard to remove from water and is very mobile in the environment. I've talked a lot about public water quality, and the UCMR program only focuses on public water supplies. But this chemical also shows up in private wells, too. There was testing of private wells in Eastham on the Outer Cape near the Eastham landfill. And some of these private wells had levels of 1,4-dioxane above the Massachusetts guideline. So landfills are an important source. It can be difficult sometimes to tease apart the contribution of a source like a landfill versus septic systems, because septic systems can also be sources as well. I would say that the detection of 1,4-dioxane in private wells in Eastham helped bolster local support for a public water system to pull water from a more pristine part of the town. This is the summary that I've pulled together from the UCMR testing for 1,4-dioxane. In Massachusetts, 170 supplies were tested for 1,4-dioxane. There were 5 water supplies that had at least 1 sample over the Massachusetts guideline of 300 parts per trillion. These were Acton, Grafton, Hyannis, Medfield, and Medway water systems. So here it's just showing, again, this is the highest concentration that was found. It's not necessarily indicative of the tap water throughout the whole town. In Hyannis, this was in an airport, in a well close to an airport. And at these levels, it's likely that the 1,4-dioxane is originating from some sort of industrial source. Below the guideline, 1,4-dioxane did show up in a number of the other supplies tested, So a total of 48 public water supplies in Massachusetts had detectable levels, so over 70 parts per trillion, according to the UCMR program. So, so now I'm going to wrap up and think about what's next for our research. What are some tips for all of you in thinking about what to do with this new information, and what are the broader implications. So for us, I'd say some priority research areas for our water quality program include testing private well water quality and predicting vulnerable supplies. So we've done fairly extensive research on Cape Cod, but we want to know more about private well water quality throughout Massachusetts. Private wells are not required to meet those federal standards, and private well owners are kind of on their own in terms of testing and monitoring their own water quality. In particular, we also want to identify where are private wells vulnerable. So identifying, for instance, where highly fluorinated chemicals are likely to be getting into groundwater, and trying to look for overlap where private wells are located as well. In addition, our work on the Cape has focused on wells in a sand and gravel aquifer, but that's not necessarily representative of other locations on the Cape, or sorry, in Massachusetts that rely on wells in bedrock. So we're interested in doing a comparison study to learn more about Massachusetts water quality in general. In New York and in New Hampshire and in Vermont, in communities where public water supplies have had high levels of highly fluorinated chemicals, there has been blood testing conducted by the state and the beginnings of planning for health studies to investigate whether there are long-term lingering health effects in those communities as a result of exposure through drinking water. And so we're interested in developing similar studies in Massachusetts in areas where levels of PFASs have been elevated. Even though water is being treated in these communities with high levels of PFASs, these chemicals can stay in our body for years, and we think that they can have long-term health effects even after exposures have been reduced. We think it's important to develop new technologies for removing emerging contaminants from household wastewater, and we're thinking a lot about efforts on Cape Cod and other parts of Massachusetts to reduce nutrient inputs in coastal waters, and to think about which of those technologies hold the most promise for also removing emerging contaminants. Finally, I mentioned that we have a lot of interest in tools for conveying information to people about levels of chemicals in their bodies and in their homes. And we have a set of tools that we'd like to develop for people to be able to get more information about their own tap water, to compare how their water system compares with other water systems, and to learn more about the types of contaminants that might be showing up in their drinking water. So at the individual level, we can think about what we all can do. So one thing that we've learned through our research is that protecting open areas around ponds, around water supplies, leads to better water quality. So you can support efforts in your own community to protect open areas. We can think about our chemical footprint, not only reducing exposures in our homes, but thinking about how much harmful chemicals we release out into the environment. So we can reduce our household reliance on harmful chemicals. Even though most pharmaceuticals get into wastewater because our bodies excrete them when we don't absorb all of those medications, it still makes sense not to flush unused medications or hazardous materials. If you have a septic system, you should maintain it so that it can do its best job possible at removing emerging contaminants and other contaminants that are regulated. And you can check out our Detox Me smartphone app, which gives you lots of tips for reducing your household's reliance on harmful chemicals. Thinking specifically about water quality, you can learn about water quality in your own home and community and learn about where your water comes from. So if you're on public water, you can look at your water quality report. You should get it every year in the mail, but you can also usually find them online. If you have a private well, then it makes sense to get your water tested and to make sure that over time that the quality is not degrading. In terms of, people ask a lot about treatment of water. If you are going to treat your water, it's important to know what contaminants might be present in your water by testing. But as a general bit of advice, we often recommend solid carbon block filters which can be effective for removing certain emerging contaminants, and they're also helpful for removing some of those disinfection byproducts that I mentioned. I don't want you to walk away from this webinar and say, oh, well, I'm worried about tap water now. I think bottled water is probably better. And I don't want you to get that impression. Bottled water is not regulated as carefully as public water. And so even though a lot of bottled water has a picture of a mountain stream or looks like it's likely to be from a pristine source, a lot of bottled water is actually just tap water that sits in a plastic bottle for an extended period of time. So we usually recommend that unless there's a really urgent or imminent concern with water quality in your community, that using tap water and filtering it if you have concerns about contaminants is a better way to go than bottled water. And now just some parting thoughts in conclusion. As a society, we tend to wait until problems really hit a crisis point before we do anything. This happens a lot with our infrastructure, and it's kind of our approach to water quality as well. We usually wait until a contaminant exceeds a guideline or exceeds a standard before taking action. We'd like to see more of a precautionary approach to water quality protection. We often find that wells or public water supplies with the highest levels of these emerging contaminants often have some red flags or warning signs that can tell us that ahead of time that they're vulnerable. Maybe they've had other contamination issues in the past. Maybe they have high levels of nitrate or they're in a densely developed area. And so we can plan ahead and think about either advanced types of treatment or identifying other sources from more pristine areas. I want to emphasize that even when there is a drinking water standard or a guideline, that it's not a single bright red line where it's safe as long as you're below it and it's harmful if you're a little bit above it. It's really more of a spectrum, and they're intended to be protective of everyone. But I'd also emphasize that our understanding of health effects is evolving. If you think about the levels of blood lead that we used to consider acceptable for children 10, 20, 30 years ago, those levels would now be considered unacceptably high. So over time, we often learn more about health effects that can happen at lower levels of exposure. Sometimes drinking water supply superintendents say, why are you always picking on drinking water? People can be exposed to these chemicals in many different ways, so why just focus on drinking water? And I think that that's the fair point, and that's why our research also focuses on consumer products and all the different ways that we can be exposed to these chemicals of concern. And I also want to emphasize that the vast majority of our public water supplies meet federal drinking water standards. We're trying to be precautionary. We're looking ahead for these emerging contaminants. We need to anticipate future challenges and be vigilant. But I'd also say that water is an important resource to preserve. If we identify a chemical of concern and it's in our consumer products, we can make a decision to not buy those products anymore, to throw certain things out of our house that we think have unacceptable chemicals. But once we put chemicals out into the environment, it's hard to rein those in if we decide that they're no longer safe. And overall, I would say that protecting water quality involves reducing pollution sources, improving source water protection, monitoring for contamination, and treatment when necessary. So I'd like to acknowledge the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition for organizing today's webinar. The work that I described was made possible with funding from federal and state agencies, from foundations, and from private donations. And I'd like to thank all the many volunteers and study participants who've taken part in this research over the years. If you'd like to learn more about any of the studies that I talked about today, you can go to our website, silencespring.org/water. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for tuning in today, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, and we definitely have some questions that have come in. One of the first ones was a question as it relates to adding fluoride to the water, and has that, the presence of that fluoridization process, has that had any effect on the chemicals that are now being identified?
That's a good point and a good distinction to make. So fluoride, which is fluorine by itself, is added to certain water supplies in order to prevent cavities. Some people think that the levels are too high, and that's a topic for another day perhaps. That same fluorine element is present in these perfluorinated or highly fluorinated chemicals that I'm talking about, but it's present in a really different form, so kind of separate topic.
Okay, great, thank you. And you talked about the fact that water treatment plants are not required to remove pharmaceuticals. Is there any movement to change that?
There's definitely a lot of research on which types of technologies are most effective at removing pharmaceuticals. And where I see the most maybe movement or concern about this are areas of the country, not so much in the Northeast, but more in the arid West, where water quantity issues are most acute. And there are communities and states that are thinking about reclaiming or recycling wastewater and turning that into drinking water. And so I'd say a lot of the research is looking at how should we be treating wastewater to bring those levels low enough. And so that's where I see the most movement in terms of removing pharmaceuticals from drinking water, is thinking about supplies where we know there's a direct wastewater impact like that.
Okay, good. Thank you. And I have a question that I'm sure a lot of us are thinking is about household water filters and water filter systems, particularly in this case the question comes in about a Brita filter. How good is that? How effective is that in removing some of these potential contaminants?
Right, that's a good question. So I mentioned a solid carbon block filter as being one way to filter out some of these emerging contaminants and disinfection byproducts. If you're talking about a filter pitcher, that also has activated carbon. It's granular. So it operates with a similar principle. It will be effective for similar types of contaminants. I think it's perhaps not quite as effective. There's not as much surface area on that activated carbon to grab those contaminants, but a filter pitcher could remove some of these as well. With any home filtration system, it's important to change out the filters as recommended by the manufacturer. If you don't, over time, any contaminants that have been trapped by the filters can start to come off.
Okay, and we have a question. Someone wanted to know they had never heard about TCEP, and could you tell them more about it?
TCEP is a chlorinated flame retardant. It's in a family with several other flame retardants as well. And it shows up, it's used in certain foams to make foams flame retardant in furniture. So that's the application I think of mostly. I think it's also a plasticizer as well.
And I know that currently you're focusing a lot of your research on Cape Cod. Will there be similar studies done across the state?
So we're looking for funding to do this type of research in other parts of Massachusetts as well.
And along the same lines, is the EPA planning to do more testing of these highly fluorinated chemicals in the public water supplies? Is there an indication on a federal level? And then related to that, is there an indication on the state level that we're going to do more here as well?
Right, so through that UCMR program, the next round does not include fluorinated chemicals. So we won't be getting that sort of overall reconnaissance like we got in 2013 to 2015. I'd say a lot of the work on fluorinated chemicals are focusing around areas that are likely impacted. So for instance, near Air Force bases, there's increasing amount of monitoring and testing of public and private wells that are nearby areas where those firefighting foams may have been used. And at the state level, highly fluorinated chemicals are a priority for DEP, and there's, I think, in areas near certain hotspots, again, areas likely to have firefighting foam. Those are priorities for future testing. But yeah, I don't know exactly what are those plans.
Okay, and I have a question that someone wants to know, are we still contributing to the addition of chemicals to our water supply, and what does this mean for our future generations?
So we are all contributing every day to chemicals being released into the environment. And I guess the sort of longer term solution that I see is green chemistry and using more and more approaches to make sure that chemicals aren't harmful, that they break down in the environment and don't have these long-term persistent effects. And I would say that another avenue for people who want to learn more about this is to think about changes to the Toxic Substance Control Act. There was a revision to TSCA last year to give the EPA some increased ability to do more screening of chemicals. Unfortunately, a lot of chemicals go into widespread production before they've been adequately vetted for safety, and so after the fact, it can be hard to stop using those chemicals once they've been used. And then finally, I would also think of new tests that scientists are developing to screen chemicals for safety ahead of time. It used to be that to figure out if a chemical was harmful, we would do a lab study with animals, and those were expensive and time-consuming and required a lot of lab animals. And there are new techniques that can mimic what happens in our cells as a way to more rapidly and more cheaply screen large numbers of chemicals and hopefully anticipate some of the harmful effects before they go into widespread use.
Okay, and we've got one last question on how effective and dependable do you think that the state public health and environmental protection departments are now compared to with how the EPA has been?
Boy, that's a hard question. I would say that just thinking about some of the examples that I talked about in today's webinar, I know that DEP worked really closely with the Hyannis water system to come up with plans to make sure their water was below the federal guideline. In some respects, the state has been a bit ahead of the curve. So for instance, in the case of the contaminant perchlorate, Massachusetts has developed a guideline that is lower than any other state and lower than federal guidelines. So states have the opportunities to set their own guidelines. So, I think that the role of a state agency is to work more closely with local water supplies, and EPA is developing standards that apply to the whole country. And their process for coming up with new standards is involved in a lengthy process. So they're slow to develop new guidelines because they have to think about the cost to water suppliers in addition to health benefits.
Sure. Okay. And I do have one more. For everyone who wants to learn more about what's in their own water, are towns required to test the water every year? Or is there, what is the cyclical process for people that, can you go to your town hall? How do you find this information, and is it done on a regular basis?
Right, so for the around 90 contaminants that are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act, public water supplies are required to test for those types of contaminants. Usually it's annual testing. For some water systems, the testing is more frequent, and I think under certain conditions, the testing can be a little bit less frequent. Every year, each public water supply is required to produce a consumer confidence report. You should actually receive one in the mail, but you could also often find them online or call your water supplier to get that information. And that kind of lays out in a pretty clear way what are the contaminants that have been found in each public water supply each year.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I have to say this has been a great discussion, and on behalf of the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition's Executive Director, Cheryl Osimo, and our entire Board of Directors, I want to thank you, Dr. Shader, for taking the time to share this information with us. It's been valuable, and you've given us a lot to think about. And I would like to thank everyone who joined us today to listen in on this call. If you're interested, the recording will be up later on both MBCC's website and on Silent Springs. And I thank you again, Dr. Shader, and I wish you all a good afternoon.
And Michelle, I'd like to thank you for moderating today, and I also wanted everyone listening in to know that that Mass Breast Cancer Coalition, if you go to the MBCC website, is helping seek funding from the state of Massachusetts to support our ongoing water quality research. So I would ask all of your listeners to check out that information and to consider reaching out to your local legislators to support funding for our research.
Absolutely. Well, I thank you for saying that. All right. Well, thank you all very much, and have a good afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.